To stay secure online, we have a lot of resources. We have great applications like 1Pass and LastPass. We also have crazy long passwords. And we have two-factor authentication. But does any of that matter? For TechRepublic and ZDNet in New York, I'm Dan Patterson with Chris Thomas, better known as Space Rogue from IBM Security. Chris, thanks a lot for joining us today. You have a long and famous history in technology and in security, and a lot of the tactics that you deployed many years ago are now being updated and deployed all over the web. But I wonder if we could first start with the history of hacking and cracking, and maybe we can start in a dumpster somewhere in the 80s or 90s. Chris, thanks for joining us. Tell us about hacking.
Thanks for having me. So myself and a bunch of friends of mine created a group that became known as Loft Heavy Industries, a sort of hacker think tank in the early 90s. Where we would go into dumpsters and pull out trash and software and documents and hardware and build our own lab, if you will, to try to hack different things and break into different pieces of software without breaking into somebody else's stuff, so that we had it in our own lab. And from there, we released a lot of different advisories. We wrote a package called LoftCrack to break passwords or audit passwords of Windows NT machines. We eventually were invited to testify at Congress. I created a website known as the Hacker News Network. And then, as a lot of companies do, or groups do, we got funding and then got bought, and that was the end of the Loft. But I've continued along over the years in the security industry, and I'm currently working with IBM's X-Force Red with our offensive testing group.
So when we talk about dumpster diving, it's kind of a joke in the security community. That's an inside joke. But literally, hackers in the 80s and 90s would go into dumpsters in order to facilitate what we call pretexting or social engineering. Can you explain a little bit about how that works?
Sure. I mean, that's definitely one reason why people would go into dumpsters. We did it more for the hardware and software at the time. But pretexting is sort of a way to find information about an individual, a person who you want to compromise. You want to find out what their password is. You want to somehow get information about them so that when you call them on the phone, they sort of think you know who they are. And that's considered pretexting. And by gathering that information ahead of time, it allows you to convince them that you are somebody to be trusted.
The security landscape now is full of threat actors, and there is a spectrum that ranges from the lone wolf all the way up to state actors and large organized criminal organizations. But hacking had a different connotation back in the 80s and 90s. I wonder if you could tell me how we've evolved, not just the behavior, but the language around it as well.
Yeah, the language is really interesting because in the 80s and 90s we didn't have anything really known as cyber, and now everything is cyber. The word hacker has changed dramatically. It originally came out of MIT and the Model Railroad Club, where if you did something unique or novel, it was considered a hack. And that moved on into the computers. If you did a unique or novel piece of code, that was considered a hack, and the people who did it were called hackers. Well, nowadays, hacker is, of course, very much associated with the criminal side of things. And so you don't really see people going around saying, hey, I'm a hacker, except in certain circles where it's considered to be okay. In most cases, in the media and whatnot, hacker is considered to be criminal or bad. So the language has evolved dramatically over the last 15, 20 years.
What does the threat landscape look like now in terms of penetration testing? And the tactics you described a moment ago were early pen testing. What does it look like now?
Well, penetration testing has become a requirement almost for a good security practice. For some places, it's sort of a checkbox item, where every quarter or once a year they're required by whatever governing body that rules their industry to have a penetration test. That's really not the most effective use of penetration testing. Continuous testing of a large network where you basically pretend to be bad guys and pretend to break into a network to try to show an organization where the weaknesses are and where the strengths are. I think a lot of times people forget that penetration testing isn't just about breaking in. It's also about discovering where the strengths in a network lie. So that way an organization can look at the overall picture of their network and their organization and figure out where their weak spots are and where their strong points are.
And one of those biggest or the biggest weak points is the password. For the layperson, can you explain why passwords are such a bad form of authentication?
Yeah, passwords are pretty bad because it's only one item, and once an attacker breaks through that item or bypasses it or gets around it or figure out what it is, they pretty much have access to whatever it is that you as a user would have access to. So passwords by themselves are not a great authenticator or roadblock, if you will, to prevent somebody from accessing something. They're pretty trivial to bypass or break, and so it's good for people to have two-factor authentication, where you have a password plus something else to act as your gateway to access to information.
Once I have a compromised password, I can do a lot of things inside a system, but how do if I'm an attacker, how do I acquire that password?
So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. Usually once an attacker gets into a network or on a system, finding the password is pretty easy. It can either exist in a file on the system or it can be sniffed off the cable, off the network. Now usually when that happens, either on the file or off the network, the password is obfuscated in some way. It's I don't want to say encrypted, but it's not the original password, and it won't work in that format. So the attacker has to convert it back into the original password, and to do that we crack it. And we can use several different methods to do that. One common method is known as the dictionary attack, where we take every word in the dictionary and we run it against the password and see if we get a match. Another way is called the brute force attack, where we take every letter, capital and lowercase, every number, every symbol, and run them in every different combination until we get a match. By doing that, we can come up with the actual password that the user had and can then use that to log in as the user and gain access to network resources that the user had. But that takes a lot of computational power. And so at IBM's X-Force Red, we've built a machine called Kraken that uses a large number of GPUs or video graphics boards to brute force passwords that we find in penetration tests. And then we use those broken passwords, those cracked passwords, and we show the executives and say, see, your users' passwords are not that strong. We were able to break all of these in such a short amount of time. An attacker may have much more resources than we do and could probably break more passwords in a shorter time. And hopefully we're able to educate the executives and the people in charge of the network so that they are able to understand the risks to their network and their business and can hopefully take appropriate action.
I want to talk about Kraken and the tech inside the box in just a moment, but to get there I want to start kind of low tech, or at least without the GPUs. I was recently in Kiev, Ukraine, and I sat down with an ethical hacker at a hotel bar, and he had a pretty old MacBook that he brought for demonstration purposes to say, this is a low-end MacBook, it's pretty old, it's running an old CPU, let's run a program called John the Ripper. And we sat there and we popped MAC addresses, and he took a large text file that he put in a key inside the computer, and we just sat there popping passwords all night. Now, I mention that because what you have is orders of magnitude more powerful. It uses GPUs, but how extensive or how distributed is technology like this? How accessible is it? And what are the consequences of powerful machines that can be pointed at passwords to pop them? What are the consequences of that?
Well, the technology is pretty readily available. I mean, we built our own specialized machine because of the fact that we're dealing with client data, and we can't really use external resources with client data. We have to keep it internal. However, bad guys don't have that restriction, and bad guys can easily use cloud computing resources to leverage those to break passwords. And they're not that expensive to do, and you can break passwords very quickly with the cloud resources, as you saw with just a lonely MacBook. Obviously, with a lower end machine, the simpler the password, the simpler it is to break it. So if a user has, say, something that's only 8 letters long and it's in the dictionary, it's going to be very simple to break versus something that's, say, 30 letters long and is just a random bunch of letters and numbers. And this is where, as you mentioned at the beginning, a password manager comes into play, because nobody's going to remember a 40-character password that is just a bunch of letters and numbers and symbols mixed up. So by using a password manager, you're able to copy and paste those passwords from the manager into the login field, as opposed to having to remember a simple dictionary word that a tool such as Kraken or a MacBook can break very easily.
Right. If I wanted to attack a target, could I just go to AWS and spin up a cloud instance and then deploy a script on it and get going? Is it that easy, or do I need some specialized skills?
No, that's pretty much it. The scripts are a little bit, can be complicated, but they're not that difficult, and there are a lot of tutorials online on how to use them, and they're freely and readily available. So yeah, it's as simple as going to, say, AWS or Azure or IBM's cloud offering and spin up an instance and run your script.
And I ask that in, again, the security community. It's almost a rhetorical question to ask something like that, but I want to illustrate how insecure a traditional or a password that you memorize and just type into your Facebook sometimes, how insecure that is. But I wonder, Chris, if you could help us feel a little more secure. What are some of the best practices that companies and individuals can do to make sure that the passwords they use are secure?
Well, and that's a good point. In the past, it was thought that we had to change our passwords on a regular basis because that would somehow prevent bad guys from getting them or make it more difficult for them. Recent guidance out of NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, has suggested otherwise, and that changing passwords every 90 days is no longer the best practice. For most people, choosing a strong password would be something of uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols. I would say at least 14 to 16 characters long, if not longer. Again, this is why the password manager comes into play and makes it so much more important to use, as well as two-factor authentication. Because then if the password's compromised and cracked, you have this other thing that's preventing bad guys from getting in. Whether that's a text message, whether that's a physical token with a number that changes, whatever that second factor is. Both of those things, choosing good long passwords and using two-factor authentication, goes a long way in securing an account from bad guys.
I want to say that one more time just so that we all hear that. Use long random passwords and two-factor authentication. That helps us stay secure now and in the short term. But what about the future? We have a couple things coming. One of them is already here, biometric security, and the other is maybe a little ways off, but still coming, quantum computing. Let's start with biometric security. When we look at Face ID on the new iPhone, or we look at thumbprint authentication, is this truly secure, or are we just replacing one password with another one?
It's getting better. In the past, biometrics, fingerprints and whatnot were kind of scoffed at by a lot of people in the industry because the fingerprint or the face print or the iris print or whatever you were using was really just converted into a password inside the system and used the same way. We're seeing companies advance the technology, especially with Apple's face print, where the face print is stored inside the device. It's not transmitted outside the device. It's very difficult to get into without compromising the integrity of the data. So the Apple face print technology is very, to me right now, I think is very secure. I think it's going to take some time for it to be further tested before the industry as a whole blesses it as a way to get in, but as a way to protect your phone, I think it's perfectly fine. So there are other advances in technology coming. Will we ever get rid of the password completely? I don't know. I hope so, because they're kind of a pain in everybody's neck. But right now, along with two-factor authentication, they're the best thing we have. And
quantum, are we all screwed?
Quantum, yeah, it's going to take cracking to a new level. The technology is still very early. I'm not sure what the promise is there or not. It may be some issues, and we may take some time as we get to it, whether or not it's going to impact our passwords or not.
Space Rogue, thanks a lot for your time today. I wonder if you could leave us with a forecast as we look into not just 2018, but the next 18 to 36 months in security. What do you anticipate on the horizon?
Well, as we mentioned, biometrics will become more and more important over the next couple of years. We're going to see a rise in IoT devices, Internet of Things, basically internet connectivity in everyday household items, which is going to have its own security implications, as we've already seen. We're going to see a further increase in ransomware, where a piece of software, a malware, gets onto your machine and then holds it ransom until you pay some money to somebody. That is a problem that's been around for a long time, but has only recently become a big problem. And I think in the next few years, it's going to become bigger. So always keep a backup of your data. That's the easiest way to prevent a ransomware attack, but be prepared for it if it happens.
That's great advice, Space Rogue. Thanks a lot for your time today. You can learn more about security by visiting zdnet.com and techrepublic.com. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe to the TechRepublic cybersecurity newsletter for TechRepublic and ZDNet in New York. I'm Dan Patterson.